The county auctioned it on a Thursday morning in March. 1,900 square feet of rusted train depot on the edge of Sutter Falls, Kansas, assessed at zero, starting bid $10, and nobody in the room wanted it. Nobody except Caleb Strand, 19 years old, who had $23 to his name, a county bus pass expiring at midnight, and a bid card with a number 7 on it. The gavel came down. He paid at the window, walked out with a deed in his coat pocket, and $13 left over, and a plan that extended only to the next hour. 3 weeks later, when he finally pried open the panel behind the ticket window in the station master's room, what was concealed there had been waiting longer than Caleb had been alive, sealed in place by Otis Drum. The last man to keep the lights burning in that building, for whoever came after him with a reason to stay. Caleb's father had left before he was old enough to miss him specifically, which meant Caleb missed something without knowing its name. A vacancy in the architecture of daily life that he understood only later as absence rather than the natural condition of all houses. His mother, Ann Strand, worked the early shift at the truck stop on Route 56 and the evening shift at whatever came available, and she raised Caleb in a 2-room apartment above a hardware store in Sutter Falls through a series of winters that required more from both of them than they had much to spare. She died of pneumonia when Caleb was 14. The pneumonia started as a cold she couldn't afford the time to treat and became something else over the course of 2 weeks in November. He came home from school on a Wednesday, and the apartment was wrong in the way apartments go wrong when the center of them is missing. He sat with her for a while before he called anyone. After that came a year with an uncle in Pratt. Quiet, decent, overwhelmed. Then the foster system, which in a county as rural as Sutter County meant placements across 3 adjacent counties, and a lot of time on school buses on roads that went straight as far as the flatland went, which was a long way. He was not a difficult child. He kept his things in order, did his schoolwork, stayed out of the way of what wasn't his business. He learned the particular economy of group living, what to ask for and what not to, how to be present without being noticeable when being noticeable wasn't useful. He graduated from Sutter Falls High School in June, the only graduation he'd been able to attend in 4 years because the placement cycles had him changing schools. His foster family at the time, a decent couple named Greer who asked reasonable things of him and whose house was always warm, drove him to the ceremony and took a photograph afterward. They moved to Wichita in September. He was moved to a group home in Greensburg. He aged out of state care on a Friday in November at the county office in Lewis. His case coordinator, a man named Portis who managed a caseload 3 times what any person should manage and did it with the particular grace of someone who'd stopped expecting the system to compensate for itself, walked him through the discharge paperwork with efficient sympathy. A bus voucher, a list of shelters in 3 counties, a printed sheet of transitional housing resources, most of which had waiting lists measured in weeks. Portis also handed him $40 from his own wallet. He said it was personal, not an agency thing. Caleb thanked him. He walked out of the county office into a November morning that was gray and flat and cold in the specific way the Kansas plains are cold. Not the wet cold of mountains or coasts, but a dry, blunt cold that came across the grass from every direction at once without anything in the way to slow it down. He had the voucher, the $40 and his own savings that came to $23 total, the sleeping bag from the group home, and a backpack holding everything that was his. He walked to the bus station and sat in it for 3 hours. He bought a sandwich from the vending machine with $4. He thought about the 4 years of placements with a particular detachment that comes from having processed something enough times that it no longer produces a sharp feeling, only a flat one. The first placement family in Grants Pass had been the Torrances, who had a list of rules on the refrigerator and a son of their own who made it clear from the first weekend that the bedroom was borrowed, not given. The second had been a woman named Arlene in Roseburg, who kept too many cats and genuinely did not understand why a teenage boy might find this difficult. The third he didn't think about if he could help it. The fourth and fifth had been adequate in the way that adequate means, nothing to name, nothing to remember warmly. He had been through all of this, and he had come out the other side with his schoolwork done and his things in order and no particular bitterness, which he considered an accomplishment. He had also come out the other side with $23 and a sleeping bag and a list of shelters that didn't have room for him, which he considered the situation as it stood. He folded the list and put it in his coat pocket and looked at the bus schedule on the wall. Route 9 went through Sutter Falls twice a day. He had until midnight on the bus pass. If he rode to Sutter Falls, he'd have a familiar town and no better options, but familiar was something. The shelter list was a dead end. First shelter had a 14-day wait list. Second had space in Lewis, but the bus connection cost $6 he didn't want to spend. Transitional housing listings required application forms sent to an address, and he had no address. He used the bus pass to ride the Route 9 Regional to Sutter Falls, where he had at least lived for the first 14 years of his life, and where he might know a face. The bus took 2.5 hours through the Flint Hills, rolling tall grass prairie, limestone outcroppings, grain elevators in the distance marking each small town before the road reached it. The sky in November was the enormous gray of the plains, pressing down on everything equally. He got off in Sutter Falls at noon. Downtown was 4 blocks long. A bank, a hardware store, a diner with sparks painted above the door, a farm co-op, 2 churches, a post office. At the east end of Main, the old train depot. Limestone walls, boarded windows, a chain on the door. A county heritage property notice faded to near illegibility on the south wall. He walked past it. He found the county services office 2 blocks off Main. The woman at the desk had the practical helpfulness of someone who had learned to tell people what the system actually offered rather than what it was supposed to offer. She told him about the heritage surplus auction. Second Tuesday of every month, she said. The depot had been in the heritage queue for 4 years. Nobody wanted the restoration requirements. Last month it went to open auction at a $10 minimum. Nobody bid. The auction was Thursday. He spent Wednesday night in the doorway of the grain elevator at the south end of town, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides and dry. It was very cold. He got through it by staying specific. This night, then morning, then the auction. He was at the county building at 8:40. The auction room held 12 people, 9 of whom were there for a commercial property in Lewis and left after the third lot. The remaining 3 looked at the depot photograph when it came up and looked at their phones. Starting bid $10, the county official said. Anyone? Caleb raised his card. Going once. He looked around. Going twice. Sold. He paid at the window. He walked out with a deed in his coat pocket. He had $13 left and a rusted train depot nobody else in the county had wanted at $10. He walked back to the east end of Main and stood in front of it. He'd passed the depot every day for the first 14 years of his life without paying much attention to it. When you grow up somewhere, the permanent things become invisible. The church steeples, the grain elevators, the limestone buildings that have been there since your grandparents were children. The depot had been one of those invisible things, a given. Part of the fixed architecture of the town. He had never thought about it specifically until he'd read the notice in the county building. Now he thought about it specifically. The limestone was the Flint Hills variety, the pale tan stone quarried from the outcroppings on the hills east of town, the same stone that built the churches and the courthouse and the old school building. It was the kind of stone that lasted. The roof was corrugated metal, rusted but intact. The chimney at the east end was standing. The foundation, what he could see of it where the winter grass had died back, showed no visible cracking. The depot was limestone, the local Flint Hills kind, cut from the same stone that made up the outcroppings on the hills east of town. Pale tan in summer, gray gold in winter light. The main room was long and low, the waiting room where passengers had sat between trains for decades. The station agent's office occupied the east end, its own room with its own door and the ticket window facing the platform. The sliding glass panel still closed, the brass bars still in place. The roof was standing. The walls were solid. 3 of the 4 windows were boarded. 1 wasn't, and through it he could see the wooden bench along the waiting room wall and the dust on everything. He collected the key from the county building and came back and unlocked the chain. The door opened. The smell of the depot was decades of accumulation, limestone dust, old wood, a faint ghost of coal smoke from a stove long gone. Something mineral and deep that came from the stone walls themselves. It was cold inside, not much warmer than November outside, but out of the wind, which on the plains in November was the more important thing. The waiting room was 40 feet long, the wooden floor worn smooth in the center where generations of feet had traveled the same path between door and bench and ticket window. The benches themselves were still there, 2 long ones, reversible seatbacks, the wood dark with age but sound. At the far end, a half door opened into the station agent's room. He went through. 12 by 14 feet, a window on the south wall looking out at the platform and the tracks. The rails were still there but overgrown, the ties half buried in dead grass and wind-carried soil. Rust on everything. The platform was cracked limestone with weeds in the joints. 3 things were still in the room. On a bent nail above the ticket window, a railroad pocket watch in a brass hunting case, hanging by its chain. Tarnished, but unbroken. On the counter beside the window, a newspaper folded to the crossword page. 11 years old, the date visible at the top corner. Several answers filled in deliberate pencil. More than half the squares were empty. And on the inside wall above the door frame, taped at each corner with yellowed tape, a hand-lettered sign on a piece of cardboard the size of a bread slice. The letters were in the unsteady capitals of a young child, written in red crayon. Welcome back. Caleb stood in the station agent's room and looked at the 3 things. He went back to the waiting room and checked the walls, the floor. Limestone solid, mortar intact. The floor was level. In the corner, a pot-belly stove on its stone pad, the chimney pipe capped at the ceiling. He opened the loading door. Cold ash from the last fire, 11 years old. He found freight pallets in the back room, stacked 3 into a rough platform in the agent's room, put his sleeping bag on top. He found candles and matches in the cabinet under the counter. He got the stove going on the 3rd try, the flue drawing slowly and then steadily. He sat on the pallet platform in the warmth of the stove and looked at the pocket watch on its nail. He lifted it carefully. The case was tarnished silver, the lid engraved with a locomotive going right. He pressed the release. The watch face was ivory, Roman numerals, the hand stopped at 417. On the inside of the lid in neat engraving, O.D. Sutter Falls Station, 40 yards. He set it back on its nail. He read the crossword. He looked at the welcome back sign. 3 things from a man he had never met. He pulled the counter away from the east wall to sweep behind it, and his hand found the seam. It was in the wooden wainscoting on the east wall, about 3 feet up from the floor, a section roughly 2 feet square that fit too tightly to be ordinary paneling. The seam ran straight and square, and when he pressed on it, it didn't flex. It was backed by something solid. He searched the agent's room more carefully this time. In the back of the bottom drawer, taped to the drawer's bottom with yellowed masking tape, a flat steel key with a square bow. At the base of the wainscoting panel, below the counter, a small brass keyhole he'd taken for decorative detail. He put the key in and turned it. The panel swung inward on a piano hinge. Behind it, a rectangular cavity lined with cedar, the scent coming out sharp and preserving. Inside, a metal cash box, a canvas satchel, and a ledger book with a dark green cloth cover. The cash box held $340 in mixed bills. He counted it twice. The ledger. Dark green cover. Binding worn smooth. He opened it. Sutter Falls Station Assistance Record. Not every person who comes through a station is passing through. Some of them have stopped in the only way that's left to them. This is the record of what was done about that. Otis Drum had been keeping this record for 34 years. The entries were consistent. A date, a name, the situation as he'd understood it, what he'd done, and sometimes a follow-up. The handwriting was precise and upright, the hand of a man who had spent his working life filling in forms correctly and had applied that same care here. January, a woman named Carol Fenwick traveling west with 2 children. Stranded when the connection through Dodge City was canceled and the rescheduled train wasn't until the following evening. No money for a room, husband waiting in Garden City and couldn't be reached. Gave her the freight room key, fed them from the station supplies, called ahead to Howard at the Garden City station to watch for her. She made the connection the next afternoon. The husband was waiting. Roy Akers from Greensburg, laid off from the grain elevator in September. Walking to a cousin in Topeka because he'd sold his truck. Too proud to ask for anything. Gave him a bus ticket and $20. He tried to refuse. I told him every station master I'd ever known kept a fund for exactly this, which was approximately true. Della Marsh, arriving in November with a black eye she was explaining carefully and a bus ticket that went only as far as Sutter Falls. Bus fare to her sister in Hutchinson, and a phone number from the desk drawer. She called 3 days later from Hutchinson to say she'd made it. A boy of 15 named Toby who had run from a situation in Coldwater. Let him stay in the freight room for 4 days. Fed him. made the right calls without making the wrong ones, and drove him to a safe placement himself. Page after page. 34 years of the same intention applied consistently to whoever came through that door with more need than ticket. The handwriting grew slightly larger in the last years, the hand of a man whose eyes were going but who continued to document with the same precision. The last entry was from the week before the station closed. Last train through Sutter Falls was Wednesday. After 40 years, the line is discontinued. I am not going to pretend this is anything other than what it is. The station has been used for the purposes it was designed for, the practical ones and the other ones. I have kept this ledger because someone should know what this place was. Not what it was supposed to be, but what it actually was, which is something different and more important. I am locking the panel and leaving the key in the drawer because I believe someone is coming eventually, and they should know. Whatever this building becomes, it should know what it was before. Otis Drum. Station Master, Sutter Falls Station, 1971-2011. Caleb set the ledger on the counter. He looked at the pocket watch on its nail. The stopped hands at 4:17. He sat down on the pallet platform with the ledger on his knees and the stove ticking beside him, and thought about a man who had worked this room for 40 years, documented every person he'd quietly helped, locked it behind cedar paneling, and left the key taped to the bottom of the drawer. He thought about the welcome back sign above the door. He was cold, and he needed more wood for the stove. He went to the freight room and got it. That was the next thing, so he did it. He was sweeping the platform on the second morning when a woman appeared from the direction of Main Street and came toward him. Late 60s or early 70s, compact and purposeful. Canvas barn coat over flannel. Boots that had seen serious use. She carried a covered dish in both hands and walked with the directional certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was going. She stopped at the edge of the platform. "You're the one who bought the depot," she said. "Won it." I was the only bidder. She looked at the building, at him, at the broom. "That's Otis's broom," she said. "How would you know?" He carved his initials into the handle. She pointed. "Bottom of the handle. O.D." Caleb turned the broom over. In the flat of the handle, aged gray, O.D. The woman set the covered dish on the platform. Hetty Sparks. She extended a hand. "I run Sparks Diner across the street. I've been watching this depot for 11 years, watching and waiting to see what the county was going to do with it. What did you think they'd do?" "Nothing useful," she said, "which is what they did." She looked at the dish. "It's a casserole. Don't open it yet and it'll stay warm." She looked back at the building. "You spent the night?" "In the agent's room. There's a potbelly stove." Hetty nodded slowly. "Otis kept that thing going October to April. Said limestone held heat, but it needed something to work with." She paused. "You're not from Sutter Falls." "I am, actually. I grew up here until I was 14. She looked at him more carefully, and something changed in her expression. "Ann Strand's boy," she said. It wasn't a question. "My mother." "Yes, I knew your mother. She came into the diner sometimes. She had a way of looking at the menu like she was doing arithmetic." Caleb said nothing. "I was sorry when she died. She was too young for it." He went to the diner at 9:30. It was narrow and warm, 8 tables, a counter with stools, the smell of coffee and bacon, and a place that had been making the same food for a long time. Hetty set coffee in front of him before he sat all the way down. The diner was the kind that had developed a specific smell over 5 decades of the same coffee, and the same frying oil, and the same cleaning product applied at the same time every evening. A smell that was the sum of the diner's history in a way that a new restaurant could not replicate. Caleb sat at the counter and drank the coffee, which was strong and made without ceremony, and ate a plate of eggs that Hetty put in front of him without asking if he wanted them. She did it the way a person does something they've been waiting for the occasion to do. The 3 men at the counter had gone by the time the eggs arrived. The woman with the newspaper had gone. It was just Caleb and Hetty and the mid-morning quiet of a diner between its rushes. "How long have you been in the building?" Hetty asked. 11 days. "And before that?" He told her about the county auction and the night in the grain elevator doorway, and the year before that in the group home in Greensburg, and the 4 years before that in the system. He told it the way he'd learned to tell it, without inflection, the way you describe a route you've traveled. These were the roads. These were the turns. This is where I ended up. He did not expect sympathy, and he didn't get any, which was the right response from someone who understood the difference between sympathy and recognition. Hetty listened without interrupting. When he finished, she refilled his coffee. "Your mother worked hard," she said. "She had a way of doing things quietly that I always respected." She paused. "I used to wonder what happened to you after. People don't always find out." He showed her the ledger. She read it the way people read things that confirm something they already believed, stopping at entries she recognized. "That's Morris Calloway," she said at one. "He came through in." She checked the date. Yes, his wife had left and he was going to Newton. She turned the page. "I knew he'd gotten help from the station because he told me later someone there had given him what he needed for the fare. He didn't say who. He never knew who." She read the last entry and set the ledger on the counter between them. "He never talked about any of it?" "Not once." Hetty wrapped both hands around her mug. "I suspected some of it over the years. Things I couldn't quite account for unless someone was behind them. But Otis, if you tried to ask directly, would suddenly remember the track report needed checking." She refilled his coffee without being asked. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Each time the coffee was ready. Each time she knew something about a ledger entry he hadn't been able to trace. Who the families were, what had happened next, the outcomes Otis had never learned. "People know," she said one morning. "Not the specifics. But when your town has someone like Otis Drum for 40 years, people carry a sense of it. They might not be able to say what they owe or to whom. They just know." He'd been working on the depot every morning, sweeping, cleaning, clearing the blocked gutters on the north wall. On the morning he found where the water intrusion was coming from, a man appeared on the platform with a toolbox and a pail of sealant. "Davis Falk. I do roofing." He looked at the gutter. "Hetty called me." He set down the toolbox. "I fixed Otis's roof a few times over the years. We had a kind of running account between us. I'd say it's still ahead on his side, so he spent half a day on the roof. He came down and left. He didn't ask for anything." The notice arrived the following Thursday, slid under the freight room door. Sutter County Building and Safety Division. The property at the Main Street address had been identified as structurally deficient and potentially hazardous. As new owner of record, Caleb Strand was required within 30 days to present a certified structural engineering assessment demonstrating adequacy, or provide a controlled demolition plan. Certified engineering assessments cost money he didn't have. Controlled demolition cost more. He read the notice twice, folded it, and walked across the street to Sparks' Diner. Hetty read it without changing her expression. She picked up the phone behind the counter. "Let me make a few calls," she said. The calls worked the way Otis's generosity had always worked in this town, through a network of people who knew what they owed and hadn't found a way to pay it yet. Gus Emery came first. He'd worked structural engineering for 30 years in Wichita before retiring to Sutter County, and was not interested in explaining how he'd ended up here except to say it was home. He came on a Saturday morning with a tape measure and a camera and spent 4 hours in and around and beneath the building. "Sound as the day it was built," he said when he came back inside. He sat on a waiting room bench and wrote on a legal pad. "Limestone construction done right is more durable than most things built today." This was done right. He filed the certified engineering assessment with the county the following week at a rate of $0. He said Otis Drum had made a specific phone call on his behalf 11 years ago when a building permit of his had been stuck in committee for reasons that had nothing to do with the permit. The permit went through in 2 days after Otis made the call. Gus had been meaning to settle that for a decade. The structural notice was withdrawn. Others came. The woman who ran the town historical society appeared with 2 volunteers and a box of archival cleaning supplies and spent a full Saturday restoring the waiting room benches. She said they were original to the building and had been in her records for years, and she was glad someone was finally taking care of them. Carl from the hardware store replaced the boarded windows with glazing he charged to the store's community account. 2 men from the volunteer fire department certified the potbelly stove as safe for habitable use, which the county required. A retired bricklayer named Earl, who had driven 30 miles from Maxville, showed up one morning, looked at 3 limestone blocks on the north wall where the mortar had crumbled, and spent the better part of a day teaching Caleb to repoint them correctly. He said Otis had done it himself the last 2 times. He said it would need doing every 15 years or so, and now Caleb knew how. Caleb worked alongside everyone. He learned the trowel, the caulk gun, the wire brush for rust, the right pressure on the stone. He made mistakes and had them corrected with patience. He used the cash in the box carefully, cleaning supplies, weather stripping, a propane camp stove for cooking. He counted what remained each evening and thought about what came next. The depot was beginning to look like a building someone was tending. On a Thursday evening in late November, with the work for the day done and the long winter light going gold across the platform, Caleb sat in the agent's room on a proper chair Hetty had donated from the diner's storeroom. He had coffee from the camp stove and the stove going, and the windows cleaned, and the pocket watch ticking on its nail after he'd wound it that morning. He opened the ledger to the last entry and read it again. The station has been used for the purposes it was designed for, the practical ones and the other ones. Stay with me. Because what Caleb found sealed in the floor of the agent's room the following week is the reason Otis kept that ledger, and wrote in it the way he did, and left it where he left it. Subscribe if this story is finding you. We're only halfway, and the part that changes everything is still ahead. The letter arrived on a Monday at the end of November, through the mail slot on the south door. Bellard Development and Land Partners, headquartered in Wichita. 4 pages. Caleb read it at the counter. The company held a county redevelopment contract signed 3 years ago with the Sutter County Commission. The contract included an option clause granting Bellard first right of purchase on any county-owned property within the designated corridor that was transferred by any mechanism other than standard market sale. The Sutter Falls Depot was within the corridor. Bellard's position was that the Heritage Surplus auction constituted a non-standard transfer, and that the county should have offered Bellard first refusal before proceeding. Since the county had not done so, Bellard was asserting that right retroactively and would be filing to have the auction result reviewed. The letter informed him of this and asked for nothing specific from him. It was informing him of a legal position Bellard intended to pursue. He read it twice. He put it in the cedar-lined cavity with the ledger and locked the panel. Then he crossed the street to Sparks' dinner. Hetty read it at the counter. "Frank Bellard," she said. She said the name the way you say something you've been waiting to see in print. "He's had his eye on this corridor for 3 years. Bought the implement dealer's building on the west end last year. And the empty lot behind the co-op." She set the letter down. He was circling this depot before Otis even retired. Made an offer on the building while it was still operating. Otis told him the building wasn't for sale while it had a purpose. "Can he do what the letter says?" Hetty was quiet. "I don't know." She looked at the letter again. "I know someone who might." Bellard came the following Saturday in a clean pickup truck. He was 55, broad, wearing a fleece vest over a button-down with the unhurried confidence of a man who was used to being the most certain person in any given room. He got out and stood in front of the depot and looked at it the way developers look at buildings, through the current reality to what they intend to put in its place. He walked to the platform. He nodded at Caleb without extending his hand. "You've done work on it," he said. "It needed it." He looked at the cleaned windows, the repointed north wall, the restored benches visible through the glass. He looked at the sign Caleb had cleaned and repainted on the south wall, Sutter Falls Station. "Old Otis really let it go at the end," he said. "He kept it for 40 years, Caleb said. "He didn't let anything go." Bellard looked at him. "Son, I'm going to be straight with you." He put his hands in his vest pockets. "I have a legal position here and I'm going to pursue it. But these things take time and cost money for both of us, and there's an easier way. I'll give you $20,000 for a quitclaim deed today. $20,000 for a building you bought for 10. That's a return you will not see anywhere else." Caleb looked at him. He thought about Carol Fenwick and her 2 children stranded in January. Roy Akers too proud to ask for the bus fare. Della Marsh with a ticket that went only as far as Sutter Falls. He thought about the welcome back sign above the door of the agent's room. He thought about the boy named Toby in the ledger, 15 and sleeping rough, who Otis had let stay for 4 days and driven to a safe placement himself. He thought about Carol Fenwick's children warming up in the freight room while their mother waited for a phone call that would tell her someone was at the other end. He thought about Roy Akers, too proud to ask. Walking west toward Topeka because he'd sold his truck and the cousin in Topeka was the only option left. All of them had come through the front door of this building. All of them had found someone behind the counter. He thought about what a building was for, actually, not what it said it was for on the county's records. What it was actually for, which Otis had written about in the last entry with the precision of a man who had thought about it for 40 years and arrived at the right words. The practical ones and the other ones. He thought that if a building could be used for both of those things simultaneously, for 40 years, without the person running it making a production of it or needing to be thanked for it, that was a thing worth understanding. He went to the freight room and got more wood for the stove, because the fire needed tending, and that was the next thing. "I'm not selling," he said. Bellard studied him. "Think about it." "I don't need to." Bellard looked at the building one more time. "I've done this a lot of times," he said. "It goes better when people see reason." He left. Caleb stood on the platform until the truck was gone. Then he went inside and sat in the agent's room and looked at the pocket watch ticking on its nail. Then he went to Hetty and borrowed her phone. Her name was Margaret Lowe, retired property and contracts attorney, 28 years in Dodge City before she moved back to Sutter County. She had handled the county's legal matters part-time for a decade. She had known Otis since before he was station master. Hetty called her that afternoon, and she arrived on Tuesday morning with a leather briefcase and reading glasses on a beaded chain and the efficient, deliberate manner of someone who had made up her mind about more difficult things than this. She shook Caleb's hand in the agent's room and read Bellard's letter standing at the counter. When she finished, she looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The option clause argument is real but procedurally weak," she said. "The county's contract with Bellard includes first right of purchase on county-transferred properties within the corridor. Yes, but the operative term is county-transferred. Once the depot went into the Heritage Surplus auction, initiated because the county could not find a traditional buyer, the transfer mechanism became public competitive bid, not county-initiated sale. The option clause applies to negotiated sales. It does not automatically extend to open auction results. Can he still win? She considered. He can make it slow and expensive, which is usually the actual strategy. She looked at Caleb. "How old are you?" 19. She nodded. "And you have a valid deed from a properly conducted county auction?" "Yes." "Then we respond." She put the letter in her briefcase. "I'll need the auction record, the Heritage Program documentation, any county communications preceding the listing, and a witness who can speak to the building's prior community function." "Hetty," Caleb said. Margaret almost smiled. "Yes, and I'll want to look at whatever Otis left behind that documents the building's use." He showed her the panel and the ledger. She read it at the counter with the same focused attention she'd given the legal letter, turning pages carefully. "This is important," she said when she finished. "Not just to your case. This is a 34-year documented record of the building's community function in the original operator's hand." She looked at the welcome back sign and back at the ledger. Otis understood what he was doing when he kept this. She left with copies of everything. 3 days later, Caleb found the second compartment. He'd moved the counter entirely away from the south wall to clean behind it, something he'd been putting off because the counter was heavy and required shifting the Potbelly's floor heat plate. When he had the counter far enough out, he saw the floor beneath where it had always stood. The floorboards were the original wide plank oak, dark with age. But one section, about 2 feet square directly below the former counter position, was slightly lighter in color than the boards around it. Not much, but he had been in this room long enough to know every plank. He crouched and ran his fingers along the edges. A panel, set flush, grain matched, seams filled with years of grime. At one corner, a small brass fitting recessed flat with the wood. He found a screwdriver in the freight room. The panel came up on a pair of hinges set in floor recesses, lying flat when closed. Below, a cedar-lined space, same waterproofing as the wall cavity. Same sharp preserving smell, 14 inches deep. Inside, a tin money box, a sleeve of oilskin holding savings bonds, and a sealed envelope. No name on the front. In Otis's upright hand. "For you." The money box held $400, bills newer than the cash in the wall cavity. The savings bonds were 12 in total, denominations from 50 to 200. More than $1,500 in face value, and some had matured beyond that. He set them aside and opened the envelope. 3 sheets of yellow legal paper, Otis's handwriting, the letters larger than in the ledger, the hand of a man writing something he'd thought about for a long time before he picked up the pen. "To whoever finds this, or to nobody in particular, which is also acceptable. I want to write down something that isn't in the main ledger. The ledger is the professional record. This is the other kind. In April, 20 years ago, a woman came to the station very early in the morning, before I'd opened the public doors. She was on the platform when I arrived. She had a baby in a carrier and a canvas bag, and the look of a person who has been going a long time on not much and has reached the end of what they had to go on. Her name was Anne. She didn't give a last name at first, and I didn't ask. I unlocked the freight room and she stayed for a week. I fed her from the station supplies I keep for situations like this, as the ledger records, and watched the baby while she slept, which she needed badly enough that I could see it in the way she moved. The baby was a boy. He was 8 or 9 months, at the age where everything is interesting. He kept reaching for the pocket watch above the ticket window. I'd take it down and let him hold it. He was very careful with it. Most babies that age aren't. But he was. She told me her last name on the 4th day. Strand. Anne Strand. She'd lived in Sutter Falls before, with the boy's father, who was gone now. She'd left and was trying to work out where to be next. On the 7th day I gave her bus fare to Wichita and $200 and told her not to argue with me about it, which she did anyway. She was stubborn in the particular way of people who have had to be for long enough that it has become second nature. She thanked me more times than was necessary, which told me something about how rarely the occasion had come up lately. She left east. I thought about her after. I hoped the boy grew up well. I hoped Wichita was what she needed, or wherever she went next after Wichita. I kept the entry out of the main ledger, not because it was different in kind, but because it felt more private. She hadn't come through on a ticket. She'd come because the lights were on. The money and bonds are for whoever finds this panel. Use them the way the building has always been used, to keep the lights on and the door open, and to be useful to someone who needs it. And if Anne Strand's boy ever comes back to Sutter Falls, he should know that his mother sat on the platform of this station in April and ate breakfast in the freight room and let her son hold the pocket watch, and that she didn't give up on things. Otis Drum. Station Master, Sutter Falls Station, 1971-2011. Caleb sat down on the floor of the agent's room. He held the letter with both hands. The stove ticked beside him. The pocket watch on its nail caught the winter light through the cleaned window. He had been the baby reaching for the watch. His mother had come to this station at 5 in the morning with nowhere else to go, and an 8-month-old who kept reaching for the pocket watch on the nail above the ticket window. She had stayed for a week in the freight room. She had eaten meals Otis had made for her in the station kitchen. She had left east with $200 and bus fare to Wichita, and she had rebuilt her life, and she had come back to Sutter Falls and raised Caleb above a hardware store, and she had died when he was 14 on a Wednesday in November, and she had never told him any of this, because she hadn't known how to tell it, or hadn't found the right moment, or had died before the moment came. Otis Drum had met him once, at 8 months old, when he kept reaching for the watch. He wound the watch with the winding stem in the back. He set the hands to the correct time. He hung it back on its nail. It ticked. He went to find Hetty. Hetty read the letter standing in the agent's room with her coat still on. She read it twice. When she finished, she set it on the counter beside the ledger and looked at the welcome back sign above the door for a long moment. He would have hated knowing this was beautiful, she said. He didn't like things that felt arranged. But it isn't arranged. That's the difference. She looked at Caleb. He didn't know who was coming, she said. He just kept the door open. The county commission hearing was on a Tuesday afternoon in December, in the commission room in Lewis, 12 miles west on a road that went straight and flat through winter-brown tallgrass. He had expected Hetty and Margaret and maybe Gus Emery. He counted 19 people when he walked in. Hetty in the front row in a good coat she didn't wear often, Gus beside her. The Historical Society woman with her 2 volunteers. Davis Falk in the back in his work jacket, come from a job. Earl the bricklayer, 30 miles from Maxville. Carl from the hardware store. A woman Caleb didn't know who had introduced herself in the parking lot as Carol Fenwick's daughter, Carol Fenwick. Entry 2 in the ledger, the woman with the 2 children stranded in January, who had driven from Newton for this hearing. 11 other people who had heard through Hetty in the town's informal channels and had decided that showing up was the right thing to do. Bellard sat at the petitioner's table with a Wichita attorney in a good suit. The county commissioners were 3 people who had heard a great many property disputes and preferred to resolve them efficiently. Bellard's attorney presented the option clause argument clearly and professionally. The contract was valid. The option for first right of purchase on non-standard county property transfers was a material term. The heritage auction had triggered it. Bellard was entitled to exercise it. Margaret stood. She laid out the county's own legal guidance on competitive auctions. A document issued 2 years before the Bellard contract was signed, in which the county's own council had defined competitive auction results as market outcomes distinct from county-initiated transfers for the purposes of option and right of first refusal clauses. The Bellard contract was drafted and signed after this guidance existed. If Bellard's attorneys had intended the option to cover auction results, they had the opportunity to include explicit language. They had not done so. Furthermore, the Heritage Surplus Auction had been approved by the county's own Heritage Program Committee before it was conducted. The committee's approval constituted the county's determination that auction was the appropriate mechanism. Bellard was asking the commission to retroactively overrule its own committee's decision. That is not what the option clause says, Margaret said, and it is not what this commission authorized. Bellard's attorney asked for time to respond to the legal guidance document. He got 10 minutes. While they conferred, Hetty asked if she could make a statement. The lead commissioner said yes. She stood and addressed the commission in the plain voice of a person who said things once and didn't repeat them. That depot has been a community resource in Sutter Falls for over 100 years, she said. When Otis Drum ran it, it was more than a train station. She held up the ledger. He kept a record. 34 years of it. People who were stranded, or in difficulty, or needed a place to stop, and a person who wouldn't ask more than was necessary. He helped them. He documented it. He left this building in the condition he left it because he expected it to go on being used. She set the ledger on the table. This young man bought it at a legal auction. He's been working on it every morning since. He found what Otis left behind, and he understood what it meant. She looked at the commissioners. A development company putting up a boutique hotel is not the same thing as keeping the lights on for the people who need them. I have lived across the street from that depot for 49 years, and I know the difference. She sat down. Gus confirmed the structural assessment. The Historical Society woman spoke about architectural significance. Carol Fenwick's daughter read a brief statement her mother had written from Newton about the January night Otis had kept her family out of the cold, 30-some years ago, and which Carol had kept the memory of ever since. Bellard's attorney came back with a revised position, even if the auction result was valid. The option clause created a right that should govern any subsequent transaction. Margaret stood. That is a different legal question from the one before this commission, she said. The question before the commission is whether the auction result is valid and whether Mr. Strand holds valid title. The answer to both is yes. Hypothetical future transactions are not this commission's concern today. The commissioners deliberated for 11 minutes. The auction was properly conducted under county procedure. The legal guidance applicable to auction results is clear. The option clause in the Bellard contract does not extend to auction results as defined by the county's own prior legal guidance. Mr. Strand holds valid title to the property at the Main Street address, Sutter Falls. The petition is denied. Bellard didn't look at Caleb when he left. He walked out of the commission room, and that was the end of it. In the parking lot, Gus Emery shook his hand and said, "Sound as the day it was built." Hetty said Otis would have sat down with a crossword and not said a word about it. Carol Fenwick's daughter said her mother was glad to know the place was going to be taken care of. Margaret shook his hand in the parking lot and put on her coat. "Now you know what you have," she said. He drove back to Sutter Falls and parked in front of the depot and went inside. He built up the stove. He made coffee. He sat in the agent's room with a pocket watch ticking on its nail and the ledger and the personal letter and the welcome back sign, and thought about his mother on the platform in April 20 years ago with a baby who kept reaching for the watch. He thought about the entry in the ledger. Whatever this building becomes, it should know what it was before. He knew what it was, and he knew what it was going to be. He cashed the savings bonds through Margaret, who helped navigate the process without billing for the assistance. The total came to just over $1,500, 15 years of Otis setting money aside in small amounts and sealing it in the floor for whoever needed it. He paid Gus for his fuel. Gus refused. Caleb said it wasn't negotiable. Otis's instructions were clear about the purpose of what was in the panels, and Gus's time and travel qualified. Gus took the payment with the expression of a man who had lost an argument to someone he hadn't expected to be more stubborn than him. He paid Margaret's documented expenses. He paid Davis Falk for the roofing materials on the same grounds. He got the electricity turned on. The county had agreed to service reconnection once the habitability certification was filed, and moved properly into the agent's room, which was adequate for one person with the potbelly stove going and the limestone walls doing their job. He put 2 months of utilities in reserve. He thought about what came next. The ledger was clear about this, if you read it right. The depot had been a transportation hub. That was the commercial function. But it had also been a warm place with the lights on and the door open. Otis had documented 34 years of that other function with the same professional attention he'd given the first one, because he considered them the same job. He talked to Hetty about it. They sat at the counter at Sparks on a Thursday afternoon, the diner quiet between lunch and dinner, the January light going flat across Main Street and the depot's south wall facing them through the window. Otis wanted it to go on being what it was, Caleb said. The letter is clear about that. Keep the lights on. Keep the door open. Be useful to someone who needs it. Trains don't stop here anymore, but people still do. Hetty drank her coffee. They stop because they're driving through and something happened, Caleb said. Or because they came back, or because they needed a place to stop and this was the place they found. Hetty looked at him. You sound like him, she said. He put a handmade sign in the waiting room window, community warming room. November through March, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., no charge. He'd thought about what Otis had done, specifically, and what it meant to do the same thing in a town where the trains didn't run anymore. The function that the trains had served, moving people from where they were to where they needed to be, didn't exist here anymore in that form. But the other function did. It had never depended on the trains. The warming room was the obvious version of it. A place where people could come in out of the cold without being asked what they were doing there. He'd seen enough places in his 19 years where you had to have a reason to be there, had to prove your legitimacy, had to be a customer or a client or a scheduled appointment. He'd spent 4 years being processed through systems where every room required a category and every category required documentation. The waiting room of a train station asked only one thing. Are you waiting? And the answer was always yes, even if what you were waiting for was not a train, but something less specific. Something to work out, or to start over, or to become clear. He kept that in mind when he wrote the sign. No eligibility requirements, no intake form, just the hours and the temperature and the door. Carl from the hardware store came and looked at the sign the morning after it went up. Otis would have done it the same way, Carl said. Not a lot of words. He looked at the building. I'll find you a few folding chairs for the warming room. I've got a stack in the back that aren't being used. The chairs arrived that afternoon. In smaller letters, basic repairs accepted. Ask inside. He'd been doing repairs on things people brought in, chairs from the diner, a storm door, a sign for the historical society. He was getting better at it. Hetty sent people. A retired teacher who needed kitchen chairs re-glued and who spent the afternoon telling him about the town while she waited. An elderly man who brought in a clock his wife had kept wound for 50 years, and who sat on a waiting room bench while Caleb worked and said almost nothing but seemed comforted by the warmth and the company. A woman who came in out of a February snow with a child on her hip and sat for 2 hours and left when the storm passed, and Caleb didn't ask what had brought her in. He met a boy named Marcus in March. 17. Off the highway with a broken bicycle and a story that trailed off in the middle and had the shape of a situation he wasn't ready to explain yet. He sat in the waiting room while Caleb worked on the rear derailleur, which had bent on the chainstay and needed the right tool and the right patience. Marcus asked what he owed. Nothing, Caleb said. The boy looked at the waiting room. He looked at the pocket watch visible through the agent's room door, ticking on its nail above the ticket window. He looked at the crossword on the counter, half-finished in deliberate pencil. He looked at the welcome back sign above the doorframe, the red crayon letters faded to a lighter red in the years since a child had put them there. His expression was the expression of someone taking inventory of a place he hadn't expected to find, counting what it meant. A place the lights are on, Caleb said again. A place where if you come in and sit down, nobody asks more than is necessary. Marcus nodded. He picked up his bicycle from where it was leaning against the waiting room wall and walked it to the door and held it there a moment. You got here the same way I did, didn't you? He said. Not quite a question. Caleb looked at him. More or less, he said. Marcus nodded again. He walked the bicycle out the door and down the platform and out to the main road. Caleb watched him go, He came back the next morning. Caleb had coffee going and he poured a cup without being asked and set it on the waiting room bench, and Marcus picked it up and they sat for a while without saying much, which was a kind of conversation too. The Historical Society photographs on the bulletin board, the depot and its operating years, the platform crowded with passengers, Otis standing in the door in 1972 in his station uniform. The stove, the benches, the cleaned windows. "What is this place?" Marcus asked. "It used to be a train station," Caleb said. "Now it's something else." He thought about it. "It's a place the lights are on," he said. Marcus came back the next morning, and the morning after. On Sunday he asked if there was anything useful he could do while he was here. Caleb showed him how to repoint a section of mortar on the east wall, because it needed doing and because the question was worth answering with something real. He didn't ask about the highway. He figured it would get said when it was ready to be said, and in the meantime there was work. By May the tall grass east of town had gone green for the first time since October. The long grass moving in the Flint Hills wind the way it moves when the roots are deep enough, not bending exactly, more like breathing. The sky over the plains was the enormous blue of a Kansas spring, open in all directions, without limit. Caleb stood on the platform of the Sutter Falls station in the morning and drank his coffee and looked at the tracks. The rails were still rusted, the ties were still half buried. The trains were not coming back. He had made his peace with this, which was easy to do once he understood that the trains had never been what the building was actually for. Inside, the waiting room was clean and warm and open. The Historical Society's photographs pinned to the bulletin board beside community notices, the wooden benches polished, the windows letting in the May light. The bulletin board held a note about the warming room running through October this year, which Hetty had proposed and the county had endorsed with a utility subsidy covering half the heating cost. In the agent's room, the pocket watch was running. He wound it every Sunday evening, which was the interval it needed. He had found the correct winding key in the third drawer, where it had been all along. The crossword was still on the counter, still half finished, in Otis's deliberate pencil. He had left it exactly as Otis had left it. He might finish it eventually. He might not. He hadn't decided. The welcome back sign was still above the door, the red crayon letters faded now to a lighter red but still readable. 3 things from a man he had met once at 8 months old and had never remembered meeting. Marcus was in the freight room, working on a screen door frame someone had brought in from the north end of town. He'd been there 6 weeks. He didn't talk much about the highway or where it had been going when the bicycle gave out. He worked carefully and kept the freight room in order, and was developing opinions about the correct way to disassemble a wooden frame that suggested he'd been paying close attention. Hetty came across the street at 9 with coffee in a paper bag, and sat on the platform bench without being asked. The tall grass moved on the hills to the east, and the sky went wider than a sky had any right to be. Hetty drank her coffee. She looked at the tracks, the rusted rails, the ties half buried in the dead grass of last season, the weeds beginning to push through the limestone cracks of the platform. "Otis used to sit out here in the mornings too," she said. "Before the last year or two when the knees got bad. He'd have his coffee and look at the tracks." What was he looking at? She thought about it. The thing that was still there, I think. He didn't romanticize the trains particularly. He just knew that a rail line, even a dead one, meant something about what a place had been and what it had done. She paused. He said once that a town with a depot was a town that used to believe it was going somewhere, and that you could still believe that, even if the trains stopped. Caleb looked at the tracks. "I think he was right," he said. They sat with that for a while. The May morning was warming. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the tall grass on the other side of the tracks, the long descending whistle that was the sound of the plains in spring the way nothing else was. A person who stays somewhere and tends it is not the same as a person who owns it. Ownership is a deed. Tending is what you do with the mornings.